Hello. Thank you all so much for coming. Hi, yes, please say hi. I love when crowds respond. Hi. This is like an amazing. Sometimes I say hi and people are like quiet and stolen, and I don't know. This place is it's a very spooky place. We're still getting out of Halloween, so stomp, clap, snap, give any sort of wonderful affirmative feedback when you hear anything throughout tonight. My name is Ryan, Ryan Cook, and this is Heather. Hi.
Hello everyone, my name is Heather. Is this on actually?
Yes. Oh yes, we can hear.
Yeah. So, my name is Ryan. I'm one of the events hosts here. Thank you so much for coming. Just a few quick things before we begin. If you got a voucher for tonight, you can only use that for tonight, but you can use that anywhere in the store. The store's going to be open until 9 p.m. So you can get a drink downstairs, you can get a book, you can buy the authors a drink or a book. We love to support our local authors and give them any sorts of libations or books or anything. So please do so. But make sure you use the voucher tonight. And there's going to be time for a Q&A, so start thinking of your questions now, because I always raise my hand and then promptly forget everything. So you can start thinking of your questions, and if you need me at any time, I'm going to be at that little desk right up there, right by the stairs, and the restrooms are downstairs by the pictorial section. So just to let everyone know.
And question time?
Yes, and the question time. It's going to be the last 20 minutes, so
yes, yeah.
Perfect. And without further ado, Heather's going to introduce our first speaker.
Yes, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Devorah Baum. Is a university professor, author of 3 books, most recently on marriage. She guest edited Grandpa's The Politics of Feeling with Josh Apaganassi. She is co-director and performer in the films The New Man and Husband, investigating the intimate dynamics of the filmmaker's own marriage. Husband includes scenes set in McNally Jackson's Soho store, which is on Prince Street, if y'all are interested in new locations recently.
And apparently I have a line in it.
Wow, and Yvonne has a line? The
Yes.
camera woman has a line?
Right,
Amazing.
right. That's how you pronounce Devorah, was the line. And
Yes, and in conversation with the oh so lovely Dr. Orna Guralnik, who is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. She is on the faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and writes and teaches at the intersections of politics, disassociation, and psychoanalysis. She's also on the editorial board for the psychoanalytic editorial board of psychoanalytic dialogues and studies in gender and sexuality. She is the therapist in the Showtime documentary series Couples Therapy, which, if you haven't watched it, it's really good. So
It's the best pandemic show ever.
It's the time when we all need it.
yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Well, I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Orna.
Thank y'all so much.
Oh, right. Thank you.
So, since we are not in a vacuum, Devorah and I met and talked about how to do this conversation with the background of what we're all going through. So, to clear up some space, I thought I would read something that helps me. I refer to it every day now to try to preserve a little corner of my mind. This is something that came out of Thich Nhat Hanh's community, Plum Village. The Buddha, a peace worker amidst the violence and conflicts of his time, said that hatred cannot respond to hatred. Only love and compassion can respond to hatred. He called this an eternal truth, an eternal law. The current conflict in the Middle East is a response to long, complex, and troubled history. It is so painful to see what is happening there, especially to civilians on both sides. We appeal to all combatants to put an immediate stop to killing and acts of violence. This is difficult, but there is no other way. There can be no solution, no end to the suffering if things continue as they are. The teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who experienced decades of war in Vietnam and dedicated his life to peace, has said that man is not our enemy. Our true enemy is hatred, ignorance, fear, and the seed of violence deep in our consciousness. From a Buddhist perspective, the wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, and beyond are a collective manifestation of human consciousness, of the collective destructive energy that exists within humanity. This destructive energy is a fundamental cause of human suffering. As members of the human family, each of us has a duty to recognize suffering within us and a responsibility to transform the seed of violence into the reality of peace. We can begin by resolving daily conflicts in ourselves, our families, our relationships with friends, our societies. The whole world needs to practice being peaceful. It is always possible to live together. It is always possible to sit down and discuss reconciliation so that a solution can be found. We need a global community of individuals living in this awareness to address the world's problems and crises. At this difficult time, it is important to take root in ourselves and calm our emotions. We invite our Israeli, Palestinian, Ukrainian friends, and all who suffer in conflict zones to sit with us so that together we may cool anger and hatred, stop harmful actions, open our hearts, generate compassion, and radiate the powerful energy of peace. Our beloved Israeli and Palestinian friends urgently need the support of the international community, of each of us. They need to know that the whole world shares in their suffering and sorrow, that we send our love and pray for their safety and well-being. This is a time for the entire human family to manifest our capacity for wisdom, compassion, tolerance, and peace. As our teacher says, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. Just wanted to carve out some space for us to be here. And before I invite Devorah to start us off by reading, I just wanted to say that I think, in contrast to what's going on, I think marriage is probably the most hopeful act people can perform. So, with that.
With that, I'll read you about my honeymoon, and you'll wonder if that's an accurate description of my marriage at any rate. But I didn't really want to add to that at all, actually. But I did want to say that peace is so elusive, and to really, if peace is the way, it's really, it really needs a lot of checking on how we speak to each other, how we interact with each other, the things we say, the things we do. And I think that your show is incredibly eloquent on showing how easy it is to lose that way, even when people really deeply want to be in peaceful relations. So, and in many ways, my book on marriage is interested in the kinds of communication that work and don't. So, anyway, but that's, the idea was for me to do just a little quick reading, and then of just a short section of the book. And the reading I've chosen, although the whole book isn't by any means a
If you, it starts to cut out, you can swap mics.
Do you mind scooching a little bit forward? It cuts off at this blip right here.
So
They can't see you is what they're saying. Okay, Josh, you're
no
gonna
one
have to
can
work
see.
with it.
It's not hearing me seems to me to be a greater problem than not seeing me.
If it cuts out, you two can swap and then we'll swap back.
So
because
am I
sometimes-
cutting out? Or was
Yes, a little bit, yes.
Keep it like this.
So,
spit in
so the reason the whole book is not just descriptions of my marriage. It's actually my marriage just shows up in it, but it's not straightforwardly a memoir at all. But I'm choosing a section that's personal here, and one of the reasons I've chosen this section is it's relatively bite-sized, but also I think it leads into a kind of psychoanalytic space in various ways. So it seems suitable for this particular conversation with this incredible interlocutor. So, but I begin this section with a quote from a novel by Javier Marias called A Heart So White. And I'll read you that quote. It says, "Our refusal to share what was a secret to neither of us, but which was nonetheless becoming a secret by virtue of our not sharing it," which for me is the most profound and extraordinary definition of secrecy I've ever come across. A secret is not something I know and you don't. A secret is something we both know, but for some reason we're not sharing it with each other. We're not saying it to each other. And that secret can begin to do some very strange things in our relationship. The thing that for some reason we're not sharing. So, straight after my wedding, I felt shell-shocked. It was my big day, and now it was over. I didn't imagine I'd have any other big days ahead of me, or none that could meaningfully compare with that one. I was crestfallen. I felt as if my life was already concluded. I was uninterested in thinking about or talking about much else besides the wedding I just had. I was honestly worried I might never get over it or past it. I couldn't even focus during the first days of our honeymoon in France on the idea of a romantic holiday and its pleasures. If anything, I felt slightly annoyed with my new husband for taking me so rapidly away from my wedding, directly into my marriage. Then I made my next strange move for a honeymoon. I started reading the very long, very hypnotic, and very distressing novel 2666 by the Chilean author Roberto Bolaño. Bolaño was brought up in Mexico, and the novel is set there in the town of Santa Teresa on the Mexico-US border. As in the real life and similarly situated town of Juarez, Santa Teresa is where untold numbers of young girls and women keep going missing. What is the secret of these disappearances? The secret, it turns out, is a crime which, though known about around the town, is not much spoken of and never properly investigated or prosecuted. The crime is perhaps too large, so large that it sometimes seems in this large novel to cover the whole of reality. The crime of violence, rape, murder, misogyny, and unacknowledged histories. During the time I was reading that book, on my honeymoon, I was having nightmares. I kept dreaming of protests being forcefully disbanded by police. In these dreams, I was often somewhere lost inside large crowds of angry women carrying revolutionary banners. I was perplexed. Why would I dream of such things so soon after my lovely white wedding? Indeed, why was I even reading of such things so soon after my lovely white wedding? Was I becoming so lost to anger that I couldn't even imagine myself into my own passions? Now that the deed of marriage was done, had I been suddenly transformed into a crusader against the institution? Was some sort of inchoate fury towards men my deep, dark, postnuptial secret? I didn't really want to discuss the novel or my nightmares with my husband because it was our honeymoon and because these thoughts and feelings didn't seem like a good sign. Then my husband, who's sitting here in the front row, read the novel, just to reassure you, read the novel after me, and though he was likewise gripped, he didn't really discuss it with me either. So we kept at it, our honeymoon, relaxing, sightseeing, enjoying the scenery, the food, the weather, and the erotics of our being together, yet all the while I was secretly seeing the world and sexual relations through the fevered eyes of Bolaño. Was that how my husband was secretly seeing things too? I didn't dare ask. At some point, however, we must have broken this pact of silence. Perhaps it was when we both finished the book. Then, when we did start to speak of what terrible brutalities we'd both been reading, my nightmares came to an end, and I also felt less arrested by the past tense of my wedding, and my honeymoon started to feel exactly like the place where I wanted to be. Still, there are many traces of that earlier experience of something shared but apart that continue to crop up in the everyday of our marriage. Sometimes I'm aware my husband hesitates before discussing certain topics with me. and sometimes he avoids them altogether because he knows how readily I get affected and upset, and because he often sees me as akin to a child, unable to bear too much reality. He might be right. Maybe that's even the secret of why I wanted to get married, in the hope that marriage might save me from having to know all the things that I don't wish to know. But what if that means that I don't wish to know myself or my own husband? I'll just read the next paragraph of the next section, which is slightly out of this. So the very long opening sentence of Spanish author Javier Marias' novel, A Heart So White, begins with the words, "I did not want to know, but have since come to know." In what follows, we learn how marriage is the condition of this transformation. A married person is a person who winds up knowing what they don't want to know, which is a curious proposition. What exactly is this postnuptial knowledge?
So evocative. Like every sentence here, you want to dive into it. I had a few thoughts that I wanted to prompt you with listening to this. I mean, one is, and I said this to you yesterday, and you wasn't sure, but it seems to me, I mean, what I said to Devorah yesterday was that I feel like the book puts marriage exactly at the intersection between the subject and society as this kind of place that has to do this incredible work of translation, does a lot of work. Marriage has to do a lot of work. And I thought it was like in this honeymoon, like you're first of all doing this transition into it, like picking, and you're reading a book that contextualizes at least gender relations, like in the context of history, geography, all of that. And I thought of it as trying to kind of, okay, how is this institution gonna locate me? So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I have a whole range of them. It's just, we're going to pick, which one can I pick? It's interesting in that in my case, and I think this dates me or puts me in I think this dates me. In my case, there was no question I was going to marry. That seemed to be a given from the moment I was born. In fact, I think my parents started saving up for my wedding when they met me. This was the kind of family I came from, it just was my itinerary through life. I didn't really have many staging points I could think of. That was just like, that will happen. I knew that. I had to get myself a husband. And so I got one, and not everyone agreed it was the right choice, but the one I got is still here with me now. So I got one, and my husband, and I think unconsciously, I was very clever about this. I chose somebody who didn't want to marry me, because if he had really been into it too, I would have wondered. I needed some resistance to this drive of mine to marry, and so I persuaded him after many years of being together that this was the right thing to do. And then, of course, the moment it happened, I then let all those other thoughts in. So the moment it happened, I then thought, what is this institution? It's patriarchal, it's misogynist, I'm oppressed, I'm trapped. I mean, I'd been racing into it. I mean, not racing, I'd gotten into it. And then the moment it had happened, all these repressed thoughts seemed to return to me. And it's a complicated institution. It's very, very personal, it's very, very private, but it's completely institutional. And it's hard to find any place on this planet where the social contract isn't in some sense linked to the marriage contract, as in society itself, in most places you look, is very, very involved in this idea of marriage. So when you're talking about marriage, you're talking about intimate personal relations, and you're also talking about the world. And one of the things I find fascinating about your show is what you presumably represent for a lot of people is the world. So it's like there's them and there's the world. And so actually the transference onto you is pretty enormous. It's like the world.
Yeah, interesting to think of the transference towards marriage. Like how when we get married, we have like this transference towards it. But
Closer.
closer.
Sorry. Symbolic word. Weighty word.
I don't want to take us too far into the transference, but generally the transference towards the analyst, I think, is always the transference towards the world. There's something like Kafkaesque about like the relationship between analysand or patient or couple and analyst. They're always talking to me and the big world behind me and asking for some kind of, what's my contract here with society, with like morality, and I think in a way, I mean, I'm maybe stretching it here, but I think when people get married, they're trying to, and actually you should probably talk about it more, because I think that's one of the projects in the book, is for people to try to think about what are they doing with the world by getting married?
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of what you're trying to investigate here.
Well, it's so, marriage is so fascinating because, in a way, the stories we have of love, the most romantic stories we have, are stories of normally two people. I understand love has made some changes since then, but I'm still back in the two people situation, who escape the world, get away from the world, and in order to fall in love, they somehow have to shut the world out. And of course, in Shakespeare and various literatures, they escape into a kind of magical place, a grove. It's often called the grove, and that can be a metaphor. It can be a literal place. Go off into nature to fall in love. Lovers want to believe. Of course, there's nothing more cliche than love, right? This is a point that Roland Barthes made. You know, there's no greater cliche than I love you. That love is the most cliche discourse we have. But in order to fall in love, you have to really feel you're the first person who's ever done it. So there's something in it, in the fall, in the language you speak to each other, that feels so original, so fresh, so untested, at least to you. The feeling that you're sort of plugged into a kind of original moment, that you've escaped cliche, you've escaped all the burden of the social in some way. But then in, for example, a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, that love can't last unless the world comes and gives it sanction. The world has to have a say, and so that love is unsustainable without the world. So there's going into the grove, there's falling in love, and then there's coming back and saying to the world, I know you think we shouldn't be together, but will you please give us your blessing, world, your sanction, world? And in the case of Romeo and Juliet, the answer is no, and they die. In the case of the romantic comedies, what's incredibly utopian, and I think politically very meaningful about the romantic comedies, is that often people who nobody at the beginning of the play thought, or the movie or whatever, thought belonged together, not only fall in love, but the world says, you know what, let's expand our repertoire of love to include these two. And then, that love story, in the form of marriage, not just romance, but marriage, brings something back to the world, to what becomes possible in the world.
When I think I tracked what you're describing, like this developmental trajectory of couples, and in my thinking as an analyst, I often think of it as people fall in love and enter this kind of transcendent place where all the defenses kind of melt and everything opens up. But then the crisis happens when they actually start seeing their partner. Comes in, it's reality that comes in. They come up against, they kind of leave the realm of possibility into the realm of reality.
It's so interesting. In your show, I hope a lot of people have seen Couples Therapy, the show. If you haven't, then it's like there's like part of you is missing. So you should go and reclaim that part by watching the show. But there's this very beautiful some of the moments that are fascinating is if you are the world, or if you are you are training their eyes on a reality that neither of them are prepared to see and experience. And the reality normally is the reality of what the other is going through, what the other is feeling, the fact that the other does have a right to their story and genuinely suffers, and some of that suffering is caused by the person they're with. So this is the reality that's very, very hard to hear. And of course, it's impossible to say things like this now without thinking of the context of the world and that we're in. But then there is this little, even for these couples who are embattled and hurting and hating and crying in front of you, then we see them leave you and you say bye, and we see them a little bit back in the grove where they feel like naughty children, and they're like there's something incredibly adorable and sweet, even when they're really in a bad state, and we've just seen the reality where they kind of revert to a moment of it's just us two again, and that's where we see the works happening in a way. Yeah.
Have a little different question. Back to the honeymoon little vignette. It just made me think of something else that I found really interesting in the book. That kept coming up in different places, but language, marriage, language, and truth. I'll read a couple of quotes from you. You said, marriage is a narrative institution. I kind of want you to talk about that because I found that really evocative. And then the question of like what is said, secrets, what is censored, what does it mean? Does marriage kind of give an injunction to speak or not to speak? Like,
yeah,
super interesting.
So again, there's many different responses to that. That's a quote from the Javier Marias novel, actually, that I introduced just now. So I will come to that. But I would just say generally, in sort of post sort of modern sort of theories and so on, there's a kind of given. Again, it's a cliche that everything is language. That even very famously for the French philosopher Michel Foucault, he says, when we talk about sex, we think we're talking about this primal force, but actually how we understand sex, it's to do with the contributions that every discipline, every discourse has made to it. So that what do lawyers say about sex? What do doctors say about sex? What do the clergy say about sex? What do psychoanalysts say about sex?
Oh, yeah.
And so when we're talking about sex, we're not really talking about this natural thing. We're talking about a made-up thing. And a lot of but the way in which sex continues to exist in our imaginations is as a natural thing, because nobody says at the point of talking about sex, I'm making up sex at the moment for you. They say I'm describing it. They don't say I'm inventing it. So the extraordinary thing about marriage is it doesn't do that. It says, it uses language to bring it into being in a very public and open way. It says, I now pronounce you married in one way or another. And everybody, and it requires witnesses to go, yep, I heard that, that's just happened. So they're now married. So then everybody agrees they've changed into married people, and that has a lot of stuff. That has implications for their taxes amongst various other things. So it's one of the few discourses, incredibly powerful discourses in our life, where the role that language plays in it is very upfront and honest about itself. It's a kind of spell we're under. And everybody has to say, yeah, I'm totally with you, I saw that happen, and I do, we do, we're all for it, and it's all going on. So the role played by language is very important. And in a way, it sort of says right up front, language has something very much to do with this. And one of the main themes in the book is the idea of because if you read testimonies of marriages, people who are married, so often they say that it's about conversation. I've totally forgotten who it is, but I quote somebody in the book who says, "You're married to continue the conversation," and so this idea from Javier Marias about marriage as a narrative institution is interesting because it gives you a notion of what betrayal might be, what it would be to be faithless in your marriage, which would be to give up on the conversation in some way. But then you become attentive in that context on what you share and what you don't share. So if I go out into the world and get myself some very good anecdotes and then don't bring them home to the husband, I think I'll keep these for myself. Was that adulterous? I mean, who am I having these anecdotes with? And why have I not brought them home to the collective conversation? And it's genuinely interesting. But one of the other things that, and we discussed this, one of the other things that is interesting in that context is this use of the pronoun we. You know, when can I speak as we? And when I start using that pronoun we to refer to me and somebody else, what's going on actually? So in terms of, am I excluding? Can I bring that we into us?
Examples.
Yeah.
Give us examples. You had some really good examples of.
Oh no, I
we.
just I know because I notice it now that if that's a little embarrassing, is it? No, I mean I hope I haven't done it with anyone here, but I notice sometimes that I'm say in a room with this is the husband and with other people, and I know that I can say we, meaning me and somebody else in the room, and I know there's a little frisson at that moment. There's like, I have this we going on over here, and you are so not involved in this we. This we is going to go off and have its own stories and have its own secret life, and because there is this idea of marriage as a kind of sharing of everything, but of course you can never share everything. So you begin to become a storyteller within your marriage. So what it will be part of the story and what won't, and what part of myself will I keep, and what relationships will I be having that are their own little stories. This doesn't mean I'm jumping into bed with other people, but I'm jumping into a pronoun with them, and that's interesting too.
I love your use of language. It's interesting because part of what I do with couples is I work with them. I try to understand, first of all, what kind of we do they have in mind, and to be responsible for what they're doing with language, like what kind of world are they creating together with their language. And people do often come into it thinking that the ideal is, well, let's just share everything, let's just say everything, and any exclusion is like some kind of adultery. But there's no such world where you say everything, and who wants that world anyhow? So what kind of world are you creating together? What are you saying, what are you not saying? And what's a secret, what's privacy? That's like a really intense negotiation between couples, like what's privacy and what's a secret. And what are you doing by speaking, by the speech act? What kind of marriage are you creating with your speech? There was that, we talked about that couple, whoever's seen it, like Sean and Erica. Sean was driving me crazy because he was using speech not to convey information, but to hide information through speech, which is like, the nightmare of a psychoanalyst. It's like, oh my God, I've got nothing to work with. He's like using language, he's like disturbing the rules of the game. Until I could convince him to like play by my rules, and use language to actually convey information rather than distract. But then it turned out that Erica didn't want all the information. She wanted some information, but other information, who cares? So like people are negotiating what they want, what do they want language to do for them in the marriage, and people differ a lot in what they consider part of the contract and what should be left out. So.
And I feel that that if you have a good conversation going with somebody, then no matter what other problems you suffer, that's going to be very hard to give up. And to walk out on that would be genuinely very hard because it's so nourishing. And whereas other things, I think, if you don't have that, no matter what else you do have, you might just think, I can't live like this. And but I don't know. That's me. But I've sort of noticed that as a thing. But I think that probably the conversation, and this so comes out in your show, and this so comes out in psychoanalysis. I think that the problematic conversations are the ones that assume they know in advance what they want. I mean, if a conversation is not exploratory, as far as I understand, it's not a conversation. But why I really like that Javier Maria's thing about secrets is, I think that's true. I think that when you're both aware that you both know something and you both think something, it's not that one of you has this information and the other doesn't. You both have it, or you both think it. And it could be a very miserable thought about the world or about your relationship and you're trying to sort of protect each other from it or just not bring it into the relationship, then that, I think, is the death of conversation. I think right there you have some real problems because you're going to be trying to you're going to be doing all kinds of things not to go there. Your conversations will be really running around that thing.
It makes me think of, I agree. At the same time, we all know what it feels like most of the time to not talk about all sorts of things. Some of us may have the good luck of not being aware of it. But I'm thinking about like conversations that are very difficult to have. Like I talk to people a lot, for example, conversations about race or just triggering conversations. Really don't like that word. Where people feel like it's never the right time. It's going to be destructive. Like the fear of like talking as destructive. Like the marriage is something that you need to like protect from your destructiveness or from, I don't know, from what? Do you have thoughts on that?
Because, well, in a way, one of the main fantasies that people have about psychoanalysis is that everybody else is talking about sex in their psychoanalysis, and just you happen to be the one person who isn't. And I have been in psychoanalysis for years thinking, I should bring up sex at some point, but I know my husband, that's all his is about. It is helpful, I think, that even if there are some things we can't discuss, like sex. My analyst and me, my husband and me. But it's helpful that we can at least name it, name my problem. But I heard from a psychoanalyst friend, because I said to this psychoanalyst friend of mine, it's a little awkward that I just find sex like I can't really talk about it. And he said, no one ever does. He said, no, he said, it's not, people don't talk about that. He said, so I think it's actually my husband's the weird one.
Josh, I think you should kind of lie down.
I am. Figuratively, I
Just be an
am.
object.
Yeah.
It seems to me, the fantasy we have about psychoanalysis is that people can go there and talk about all the things they can't talk about. But of course, I think what I found in psychoanalysis is I go there and become more acutely aware of what I can't talk about.
Did you want to ask the audience any questions?
Did you what?
Did you want to ask the audience if they have any questions?
Oh, we have
we're
reached
at
that
that
point already?
It's 7:45. It's
Oh my
been.
God.
I know we could talk all night. We close at 9, so we have till 9, right?
Alright.
Yeah.
Well, we have till 9:05. We started 5 minutes late, so we're good. You're good.
We've got a good 5 minutes in us.
Sorry. Actually, it's 10 till. Yes. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm, first of all, talking about sex is doing it. So that's one of the reasons it's complicated to talk about sex in analysis.
You mean
That's
reenacting?
true, but I
You
need you to
reenacting?
explain that. Yeah, I sort of need you to just, yeah, I'm not going to say anything.
Well, the moment when I let's say a couple's is sitting and talking to me, and I might say to her, why don't you suck him off? We're just doing it right there.
Yes.
Right?
You're right. I think you are.
That's a problem. So
Yeah.
that's number one problem. We're getting a little bit off the topic.
Yeah, I would say marriage is
Right.
Typically,
But what do we believe that talking is the way to do a good marriage? I like the sentence in your book where you were talking about like you'd want to marry someone with whom you want to continue the conversation. I loved that. But does that mean that a good marriage is a marriage in which you talk about everything?
Was it it's Ford Maddox Ford, I think, is the author of that sentence. I now remember. But I read it. I came across it in a novel by Julian Barnes, which is really he wrote after the death of his wife. But and when his conversation had been brutally ended, and what he was still having to talk to her, but she was no longer there, and the unbearableness of that, of a conversation that you need and you crave, that sustains you going. But the extraordinary thing about, I think, marriage as conversation is we don't know what conversation is. And if you read a lot of these, I read a couple of self-help books about marriage when writing my own book about marriage. And one of the things I found about those books was they were very helpful. And whilst I was reading them, I was like really doing excellent comms with my husband. So he would do the annoying thing, and I'd totally have it down, like, oh, I say this now. And then he doesn't do that bad thing anymore, and we're scot-free, and it does work. But it's not a conversation, and it's a weird sort of comms operation where everything just ticks along very nicely, and because the real pleasure, and I would discuss this with you yesterday, and I can't help thinking of it in relationship to these terrible global events that are destroying us all. But the real pleasure of romantic comedy, and the real pleasure, I think, the real genius of love and a good marriage is that people are weaned off their addiction to being right the whole time when it's working. They're weaned off their self-righteousness, which is, I increasingly feel, based on various conversations I've been having recently, has got something very, very deep, is very involved in murderousness. And we all practice it all the time, especially if we're online. But we're all involved in this self-righteousness. And it's really hard not to want to be right the whole time. But in love and in a good marriage, what you're addicted to is the other thing. You just love the fact that this person is proving you wrong the whole time. And there'd be no fun at all in being like, I'm right and you're right, and we're both right, and well, look at us being so right. It's like, no, I'm tell you I'm right, and then you prove me I'm wrong, and then I prove you're wrong, and we're just endlessly wrong, and that is the pleasure of it. So taking pleasure in not just being wrong, but being shown that you're wrong is great, no?
Absolutely. It's like that's when experience from the outside can come in and change you.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you stop being lonely.
It's when you stop being lonely. Yeah. When you can enjoy not being perfect. When you trust somebody enough to not be perfect. And I think it improves over the long term, you know, and I think it improves over the long term. But conversation in marriage becomes so extraordinarily eloquent in marriage that there's a wonderful film by a wonderful filmmaker, British filmmaker called Joanna Hogg, called Exhibition, in which it's a couple, they're not getting on very well. We only know that, we don't see them interact at all. They don't sleep together, they don't talk to each other. But when one of them closes a cupboard, the other gets the message, you know? So that somehow the entire sort of sound system in their house is part of the conversation. And so when they make up, you know, it's mysterious. They've made up partly through listening to the way the other one ran down the stairs. So it becomes a world of unbelievable meaningfulness where every sound is speaking to you.
It's beautiful. Okay, we have to open it up for the audience. Thoughts, questions, musings?
How long have you been married?
Do you know the answer to that?
This is a quiz.
12 years, right? 12.
12 years. 12 years, but there was the 8 years before that when I had to cajole him into it. Yeah, it took a while. Yeah.
And still keep the conversation going. Great.
The conversation's still going, yeah, I would say. Would you say?
Yeah.
No.
Hi.
I have a question. How has being parents changed the conversation? Assuming that's not a secret.
No, it's a secret from us, not from you. We just, when I had children, I was much less impressed with Freud than I had been before, because I thought, oh, he's just doing, we started doing the Oedipal complex by numbers, basically. It was just like nothing, everything Freud said about that, just, it was so obvious. Like, I had this child, it was like to my husband, get out of the bed, I've got someone new. And he's the one I'm interested in, go away. I was like, I want back in that bed. Get away, you two. Break it up. And no, I like this one, not you. and so the conversation became fraught and difficult because we had multiplied. We'd gone forth and multiplied, and And that sort of idea of two against the world, or the romance of two, you know, the moment you have more than two, you have, as a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas says, the moment you have two can be in paradise, right? They can be in paradise. They can be in a relationship of infinite responsibility, giving to each other, meeting each other's needs. The moment there's three, then you've got, then politics has entered paradise, economics has entered paradise. There's different needs that need meeting, and somebody's going to feel left out or underappreciated. And then you bring another one in, and then yeah.
The husband wants to speak.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, no, really.
Yes,
But just
yes.
to follow that point about the third, you know, entering, we've been talking about marriage as this duality, and then there's the third, the other, the world, language, whatever, you know, is coming. But in the last series of couple series, you know, explicitly you go into, let's say, non-standard arrangements, polyamory, people exploring these things, and, you know, you must have seen in your career change, socio-historical change under new economic and political conditions that are reflected in I just wondered if you could speak to that, I guess, specific, not relationships in general, but like maybe with marriage or with a commitment. You know, what is that then? What's going on with that? The show seems to slightly, if you haven't seen it, goes quite deep into it. It also kind of has a certain, not cynicism, but a sort of critical stance. What are people really doing when they want to introduce a third into an actual, you know, rather than two against the world, with the world inside, you know?
That's a huge topic. And we were talking about, yesterday we were talking about thirds, like that's a whole thing that Devorah and I wanted to talk about, which is like triangles and thirds. But first of all, I think all couples have some kind of third going on, whether it's the child or whether it's society or whether it's work or another person, real or imagined. I mean, there's always thirds. And I think kind of non-traditional relationships, they kind of amplify it in a certain way. But there's actually nothing new under the sun with those arrangements. It's sort of more of the same, just more. I have like my own, I'm kind of hijacking your question, and I have my own theory about why there's a proliferation of these alternative arrangements, which I actually think it has to do with like climate catastrophe, that people are looking for all sorts of new kinship structures to kind of deal with the fact that we're way more dependent on each other than we'd like to believe. So I think that's my interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah, I love that reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that reading too.
Yeah. But I actually, while we're on the questions, I wanted to ask you guys, how did the book change your conversation?
Do you think it? We have this. We made a couple of films about marriage as well. So
Beautiful.
And so, it's odd. It's odd to be married and so focused on thinking about your marriage. That wasn't my plan when I got married. I never intended to think about it again. And but one of the contentions of this book, which I think I try to back up in various ways, is marriage is everywhere but nowhere, right? It's so all-encompassing. It's been with us for as long as we can remember. Seemingly there's no chronicles of human life anywhere in the world that preceded marriage. And we know of no corner in the world where it isn't sort of in human societies a presence. And so it's really saturated culture. And in the culture that I was raised in, particularly I teach in a literature department. Particularly the Western canon, the marriage plot is very, very determining, and of the stories we might tell about a life. And I told you my own story of my own life. That was the kind of narrative trajectory I had from a very early age. So it seems like it's completely colonized our imagination, and it's all we think about it. But if you look over into philosophy, it's like not there. Just no one's thinking about it over there. There are a couple, but really very few, and those, fascinatingly, who do think about it tend not to be married, as though thinking about it and doing it aren't possible to do together. And then there's those who mention it, but in a weird subsidiary way, as though it's just not a very important topic. So it seems to be everywhere, but sort of strangely unthinkable. So when I started thinking about marriage for the sake of writing this book, I worried it would jeopardize the marriage. I thought this might be dangerous for the marriage, especially because those who have thought about marriage, on the whole, are feminists. And so the first literature you come up with is pointing out all these problems. And then I raged against, I then immediately brought them into the relationship. And I recognized them. But my general feeling about thinking is it's enriching and it makes new things possible. So ultimately, I think it's improved our marital conversation. And because I think that's partly because I find that people have very cynical views about marriage. They think it's sort of, all the fun happens before it, then afterwards you're in the weird landscape of the happy ever after where it's not happy, it's barren and nothing happens. And actually, it's really fascinating. A marriage, what happens over the course of a marriage is fascinating. And so, but you have to allow yourself to notice that in order to experience it, I think.
Other questions, thoughts?
What you just said about thinking about marriage, and I'm only in the first chapter and I suspect there are many answers, but if you each had a short list of books, maybe fictional representations that really help you find productive in thinking about marriage, what might be on it? And when we were married, a friend of mine, a mutual friend of ours, asked me if I'd ever read Middlemarch, and I said, no, I just never had the motivation. It's 600 pages. And she said, you should. And I read it after we were married, and I find it in that category where it's, perceptive, empathetic, but the marriages are disasters, and yet it doesn't put you off at all, but it helps you think and make a softer landing of things. So I wonder if you had things that would be on your short list?
This book.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's you must read this book. This book is the only. Forget George Eliot.
You talk about George Eliot in wonderful ways in here. I mean, she dives deep into that. So this is a great.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not all bad in Middlemarch. All the most.
Yeah. Mona Simpson said that she had found in her life and in her career that if she couldn't be with a man who couldn't read Middlemarch, and her ex-husband was in the audience, and he said, "Yep, I still haven't," and it just became sort of this litmus test that she applied to her relationships was Middlemarch.
There's a book I discuss in this book, a wonderful novel by Norman Rush called Mating, in which, no, in fact, is it Mating? Yeah,
it's called Mating.
In Mating, there's the couple getting together. There's this extraordinary narrator, and she's getting together with this guy she's falling in love with called Denton, and she checks if he's read Middlemarch. He says he has, and then later on he admits, actually I've only read a little bit of Middlemarch, and then towards the end he says, you know what, I've never read Middlemarch, but I will now. And that's their marriage. It's like, that's the marriage vow for them. It's like they've gotten to the point where he's going to read Middlemarch.
Really, you can ask something?
Yeah, we've talked so much about language, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on silence, because I feel like marriage in particular, but relationships, there's this lore about how you communicate without language, and it's the talking cure, so I'm just curious about thoughts on silence.
I can tell who you're related to. The silences in the show are beautifully eloquent, aren't they? The main thing we know about silence is there are many different silences, and some speak, and some don't. In this novel, Mating, that I just referred to, there is this moment when Denton, this character, seems to fall into a satisfied silence with our narrator. And she feels there's something smug about that silence. She feels that silence is assuming there's a sort of perfect communion between them. And she thinks it's a privileged silence. That there is a kind of silence that is privileged. And that because she thinks there is always more to say. And so that's one kind of silence. But the silence that is the one that plagues me in my life, not just in my marriage, is when not only that I can't find the words or I don't know what I have to say, but the very strong feeling that what I do have to say couldn't possibly find a willing ear. And so to see those silences speaking on your show, I've never seen it before. It's the most extraordinary thing to witness. It's just an amazing thing to see. So I think in some ways your show is about silences speaking.
Yeah, I think we're at capacity. Sorry, I cut it off 10 minutes later.
But could we just have that your answer to that question?
Silence. People, I'm thinking of people in sessions that talk about the experience of, she thinks everything's okay, but there's so much going on in my head and I can't say it. She thinks everything's okay, and like the alienation in that, and that what you're describing, that feeling that whatever I have to say cannot find an ear. But then there's also the fact, just like you were describing with the cupboards, like I remember my friend Boaz used to say to me that my wife and I don't solve problems by talking. We just feel our way through. And I've come to really respect that. I mean, sometimes talking is just like a lot of gibberish and just filling in space that doesn't need to happen. So yeah, there are all kinds of silences. Thank you.
Thank you so much.